A Week in the Woods, Day 2. After supper, Leon smiled at Mark and said, "Come, I'll show you our new apartment." Through a door at the rear of the kitchen, a short stairway went down to a small living room with 2 easy chairs, a couch, and a pair of end tables. Nothing fancy, but comfortable and homey. Leon pointed to his pride and joy, his big screen TV. "See? 112 channels now. Satellite. Very clear." Mark nodded. "Great." There was a small kitchen off the living room, with a simple wooden table and 2 chairs. There was a bathroom, a roomy bedroom, and like the rest of the addition, everything was fresh and new. The views from these windows were not as broad as the ones from the upper levels, but the scenery was just as dramatic. The sunset was past now, and it was dark enough to see a few faint stars above the snowy hilltops to the east. Anya came down the stairs, and Leon went to meet her, putting out his hand and bowing like a fancy gentleman. "Welcome to your castle, my lady." Anya smiled slyly and said, "Don't be foolish, Leon." Mark felt awkward, like a stranger in their home. He said, "I'm pretty tired." He turned and trotted up the stairs, and he didn't answer when they both called good night after him. Mark found his room. They had done what he'd told them to do. Same bed, same bedspread and drapes, same carpets and bookcases, same desk and dresser. And he could tell Anya had tried to arrange his stuff just like it had been last week. But it wasn't the same. Nothing was the same. Mark lay down on his bed. He didn't even take off his shoes. He pulled his old down comforter up around his chin and lay still, staring at the perfectly smooth ceiling in his new room. An hour or so later his eyes closed and he fell asleep with the lights on. Chapter 4, Attitudes. For the first 2 days, Mr. Maxwell had given the new boy the benefit of the doubt. Maybe the kid just felt shy or homesick, or maybe he was trying to prove himself, be sort of tough. He was a good-looking kid, maybe a soccer player, or at least that kind of build. Sharp brown eyes, seemed plenty bright, and he certainly dressed nicely and wore his hair neat and not too long. But after 22 years in the classroom, Mr. Maxwell could spot a slacker a mile away, and by Wednesday afternoon, at the end of his 3rd class with Mark, he'd reached his decision. This new boy was a slacker. It was written all over him, like the way he chose to sit at the rear of the room, or the way he leaned back with his chin up, his head tilted a little to one side, his eyes half closed. The boy didn't pay attention, didn't even pretend to. This one had a bad attitude. Everything about this kid said, "I don't care, and I don't care if you know I don't care." Then on Thursday morning, Mr. Maxwell learned who the new kid was. He was talking to Mrs. Stearns, the reading teacher. "That new boy named Mark?" he asked. "What's he like in your class? He's not doing a thing for me." Mrs. Stearns opened her eyes wide. "You mean you haven't heard who he is?" Mr. Maxwell shook his head. He didn't spend much time in the teacher's room, so he was always behind on school gossip. Mrs. Stearns leaned forward and lowered her voice. "He's the boy from the family who fixed up the Fawcett farm, and he's an only child, too." Like everyone else who had heard this news, Mr. Maxwell's eyebrows went up. He said, "Oh, really? The Fawcett place, eh?" Everyone in Whitson knew about the Fawcett place. For months they had been talking about it, waiting to see what kind of people had bought the old farm property, plus another 400 acres surrounding it on the crest of Reed's Hill. The buyers had closed the deal in late September, and according to Beth Keene at Mountain Real Estate, the total sale price for the old farm and the surrounding parcels of land had been $2.5 million. That was big news in Whitson. But the news didn't stop there. 3 days after the deal was settled, the building contractor and an architect from New York had come to town and set up an office in a little storefront on Main Street. The contractor put out the word that he was looking for first-rate tradespeople, as many as he could find. High-paying construction work was always scarce during the fall and winter months, so plenty of people came looking. Carpenters, bricklayers, stonemasons, plumbers, heating and air conditioning engineers, cabinet makers, electricians, painters, wallpaper hangers, and a host of others. And everyone who was hired had to agree to one condition. All the work had to be finished by February 1st. The contractor was offering top wages and plenty of overtime, so people signed on and went right to work. One team began restoring and remodeling the original farmhouse. An even larger group began building a new addition that was almost triple the size of the original house. At one point, more than 60 men and women were hard at work out at the Fawcett place. The tight deadlines meant that crews were working day and night. Near the end, some of the workers from distant towns even parked their RVs in the pasture in front of the house and lived on the site until the job was finished. And the job did get finished. By comparing notes, the local people figured out that the materials and labor for the work must have cost the owners at least another $1 million, not to mention the new furnishings. There's nothing that attracts quite as much attention as large amounts of money. So it would be fair to say that in the modest little town of Whitson, almost everyone was curious about these new neighbors. After all, any people who had a few $1 million to throw around were bound to be interesting. Might be a movie star, or even 2 movie stars. When Mrs. Stearns told Mr. Maxwell the news, his attitude towards this new boy changed instantly, but it didn't change for the better. Because the only kind of people Mr. Maxwell disliked more than slackers were environmentally insensitive, by-the-whole-world rich folks. And the only people he disliked more than rich folks were their lazy, spoiled kids. Chapter 5. Zero Pressure. George Washington and Abraham Lincoln stared at Mark from the calendar that was thumbtacked next to the chalkboard. Mark stared back and forced his mind to work. Friday, February 27th, he thought. It's Friday, February 27th. So that means I've been at this school exactly 10 days. Feels like 10 years. Mark was having trouble staying awake. He propped up his head and chewed on the end of his pencil. Anything to keep his eyes open. The teacher. Was it Miss Longhorn or maybe Mrs. Lego? Whatever her name was, Mark thought she was a lousy math teacher. In fact, the moment Mark had walked in the front door of Hardy Elementary School, he decided that the whole place was lousy. Before Monday, February 16th, Mark had never set foot inside a public school. He'd had 3rd grade, 4th grade, and half of 5th grade at Lawton Country Day School in Scarsdale. The 2 years before that, he'd been at the American School in Paris. Before Paris, it was kindergarten at the Hames School in New York City, and before he'd gone to a Montessori school in Santa Fe. He glanced at the fraction problems on the chalkboard and fought back a yawn. He thought, I learned all that stuff ages ago. Mark shifted in his chair and looked out the window. More snow. For the past week, at least 2 inches of snow had fallen every day, and Mark was glad. The snow was like a layer of soundproofing. It made everything quiet, and quiet was something Mark had begun to appreciate. A stretch and a yawn earned Mark a disapproving scowl from the teacher. He straightened up in his chair, but slumped down again as soon as she looked back at the chalkboard. He thought, at least I get to sit in the back of the room at this school, so I guess that's one good thing about the place. Mark also liked that there were so many kids in every class. At Lawton Country Day School, Mark's classes had been small, no more than 12 students, sometimes as few as 5. In classes like that, there was no escape, no chance to slack off. Never. But here, there were 24 other kids. Zero pressure. Scanning the room, Mark looked over his classmates. He stared at the backs of their heads and tried to remember some names, but even a clear look at their faces wouldn't have helped him much. Mark could only recall the names of 2 kids. 2 names in 10 days. That's pathetic. Mark gave a mental shrug. But so what? It's not like it matters. When Mark had arrived for his first day in the middle of February, in the middle of 5th grade, he decided the place didn't need him any more than he needed it. In 4 months, 5th grade would be over, and he'd be gone for good. And these kids? Were any of them looking for a new friend? Why would they be? The way it looked to Mark, most of the kids at his new school had been together since kindergarten. Hardy Elementary School was an old school to them, and they were the old kids. And by the middle of February, in the middle of 5th grade, they had themselves pretty well sorted out into pairs and sets and groups of friends. Mark had no place in their universe, so he kept to his own little orbit. By the middle of February, in the middle of 5th grade, the old kids at the old school had also gotten themselves sorted out academically and in just about every other way possible. They knew who the best students were and which of their friends were going to be in the accelerated math group or the low English group at the middle school. And they also knew which girls and boys would probably make the basketball teams and the soccer teams and who was the best artist in the 5th grade. They knew these things because most of the old kids had been looking at each other and listening to each other for years. And they had been watching as the teachers looked and listened too. Suddenly all that information felt like it was important, so the old kids were getting things figured out. By the middle of February, in the middle of 5th grade, it was starting to feel like elementary school was ending. The old kids were looking ahead to sixth grade at the middle school. Big brothers and sisters had told them who the nice teachers were, and also which ones to watch out for. So the old kids had begun to talk about stuff like that at lunch and recess, and when they walked home after school with their friends. But Mark, that kid who moved into that huge house out west of town in the middle of February, Mark didn't know a thing about this school or the kids in it. He didn't even know the name of the middle school. After a week or two, most new kids would have found someone who was halfway friendly. An old kid who didn't mind answering a lot of questions, because most kids would have wanted to figure out what was going on. But Mark Robert Chelmsley hadn't done that. He wasn't like most kids, and especially not like most kids in Whitson, New Hampshire. That's why the other fifth graders left him pretty much to himself, which seemed to suit Mark just fine. Even Jason Fraser left him alone, and Jason rarely missed a chance to bully someone. In this case, Jason had made a good decision. Mark had taken private karate lessons 3 afternoons a week since he was 6. He knew self-defense. Jason would have learned quickly that Mark Robert Chelmsley was not a boy to be bullied. During 4th and 5th grades in Scarsdale, Mark had also had math and English tutors come to his home 2 afternoons a week, and a month before moving to Whitson, he had taken his private school entrance exams. He'd done well, and that's why he was already accepted into Runyon Academy. Next year, he'd be going to one of the most exclusive prep schools in America, the kind of school attended by presidents and senators and their children and grandchildren. Nothing but the best for you, Mark. Nothing but the best. That's what his dad had said. A week before the move, his mom had said, "Now, Mark, I want you to make the most of these next few months up in Whitson. This school will be a nice little break before you get down to some serious work next year at Runyon." That's what she'd said. What Mark had heard was this: "Mark, all you have to do is have a little fun and try to stay out of trouble until you leave for summer camp. Because what happens at Hardy Elementary School doesn't really count." So Mark didn't care which teachers at the middle school were nice. He didn't care which kids were the smartest or the best soccer players. And if he found himself starting to care, or even starting to wonder about things like that, he told himself, "It's got nothing to do with me." Mark knew that his parents were some of the richest people in this part of New Hampshire, maybe some of the richest people in the whole country. It was something he tried not to think about, but he couldn't really forget it, not in Whitson. Being rich at Lawton Country Day School hadn't mattered. Mark had fit in perfectly. The other kids there had worn blazers and shirts and ties and shoes just as nice as his. Kids at his old school didn't wear clothes from Walmart. In fact, there wasn't a Walmart within 20 miles of Scarsdale. At Lawton Country Day School, the other kids had plenty of spending money, just like he did. And after school, the cars that came to collect the other children were just as expensive and new and fancy as the ones that came for him. Here in Whitson, all the other kids rode home on the bus or drove home with their moms or dads in minivans or pickups or cars like Jeeps and Toyotas. Mark was the only kid in town who got picked up by a driver in a big Mercedes. And after the way the kids had stared at him on his first afternoon, Mark had told Leon not to get out and hold the door open for him anymore. Being from such a rich family didn't make Mark feel like he was any better than the other kids at Hardy Elementary School. Not better, just different. So he kept his distance. No sense pretending. 3.5 months and he'd be gone. "It's not like Whitson's going to turn into my hometown or something," he told himself. Mark knew that from the start. First this crummy little school, then summer camp, then Runyon Academy, gone. Apart from their new company over in Lebanon and him going to school at Runyon Academy, Mark knew there was another major reason his parents had bought the big old house outside Whitson. It was because his mom liked different places and new projects. At least she liked them for a while. The 3 years in Scarsdale had been the longest time Mark had ever lived in one home. Since his parents spent most of their time at meetings and conferences or entertaining business associates at the house in Palm Beach, Mark knew what would happen when he started at boarding school. Once he got settled at Runyon, Mark knew that the house and the old barn and the 400 acres in Whitson would stop being home. No one would even call it that. Mom and Dad would start calling it the New Hampshire place. It would become just another place to visit for a while, like their Santa Fe place, and their London place, and their Palm Beach place, and now their Scarsdale place. As math class ended, the bell rang, and Mark jumped in his seat. Then a girl next to him giggled, just as she had on Thursday. Mark felt his face start to get hot. 10 days, and that metallic ringing still startled him. He couldn't get used to it, and he didn't want to get used to it. He didn't want to get used to anything at this school. The math teacher began scribbling Monday's homework assignment onto the chalkboard, and the kids began copying it down. Not Mark. He pushed his chair back, picked up his backpack, and walked out into the noisy hallway. He took a left and headed for Mr. Maxwell's room. One more class, and week number 2 would be over. And then there would be only 14 more. Chapter 6. Spoiled. Mr. Maxwell had developed a set of rules during his years as a 5th grade science teacher. These were not rules for the students. They were rules for himself. For example, he had discovered the 5-minute rule. If you want your students to get excited about something, never talk about it for longer than 5 minutes at one time. Break this rule and the students will think that you and your topic are boring and stupid. He had also formulated his famous lost homework rule. When a student claims that his or her homework is lost, arrange with the student's parents for an after-school homework search. Go with the student to wherever the assignment was lost and try to find it. The first student to experience the lost homework rule was a boy named Timmy Weston. Timmy had announced that he had lost his science homework somewhere in his room at home, so Mr. Maxwell had called and gotten permission from Mrs. Weston to drive Timmy home after school and help him with his homework hunt. Even though Timmy and Mr. Maxwell looked for almost an hour, they never did find the mysteriously missing assignment. So, was the lost homework rule useless? Not at all. Mr. Maxwell had only needed to use that rule once. Timmy never lost another assignment, and neither did any other kid in any of Mr. Maxwell's classes. And it had been that way for 12 years. Every kid in town heard about what had happened to Timmy. It had become a Whitson legend. Every kid knew that if you told Mr. Maxwell that your dog ate your homework, Fido better have actually eaten it, because the teacher was nuts and he would come to your house after school with a doggy stomach pump and help you look for it. There was one rule that Mr. Maxwell put to good use every single week. He called it the Friday rule, and it was very simple. Be sure to save your most interesting material for Friday afternoons. Friday, February 27th, was no exception to this rule, and when his last period, 5th graders, came thundering in, Mr. Maxwell was ready for them. This afternoon, they were going to have a little fun with chemistry. Strictly speaking, chemistry wasn't part of the 5th grade science curriculum, but the state guidelines did say that science teachers should foster a child's natural curiosity. Today, Mr. Maxwell was going to do better than that. With the help of a little basic chemistry, he was going to show his students that science could be interesting, sometimes amazing, and maybe even a little scary. This particular Friday, Mr. Maxwell had an additional goal. Sure, he wanted to put on a good show, so he could end the week on an upbeat. And, yes, if he kept everyone interested, that would take care of the usual Friday afternoon silliness. But today, what he really wanted was to hook that new boy, to get Mark Chelmsley to sit up and take notice, get the boy to feel like he was part of the class. The kid certainly seemed like a slacker, and he acted like a spoiled rich kid, too. But Mr. Maxwell had noticed something else. A lot of the time, the boy looked sad. 2 weeks and he hadn't made even one friend. This year's 5th graders were some of the nicest children he'd taught in a long time, so Mr. Maxwell didn't think it was their fault. Had to be Mark's fault. He was keeping himself cut off on purpose. Mr. Maxwell liked a good challenge, and getting a kid like Mark to loosen up and get with the program, that was part of what he loved about teaching. As the kids came in and settled down, Mr. Maxwell began laying out his safety equipment on the wonder board. That's what he called the small black-topped lab table he tossed into the back of his pickup when the regional high school got its new science equipment. The wonder board wasn't fancy. It didn't have a sink with running water or a shiny gas valve for a Bunsen burner. Still, when Mr. Maxwell dragged that little table to the front of the room, the kids all knew what it meant. Showtime. The bell rang and Mr. Maxwell put on his white lab coat, a gift from his sister. As he began to button it up, the room fell silent, pausing dramatically. Mr. Maxwell swept his eyes across the audience, and then he began. In the late afternoon of May 6th of the year 1937, a crowd had begun to gather at the Naval Air Station in a town called Lakehurst, New Jersey. The people and the reporters were waiting for something. They were waiting for an airship. This was not some blimp with Snoopy painted on the side. This was not a flying billboard to advertise tires or to take pictures at the Super Bowl. This was a huge, silver-gray airship that had traveled all the way across the Atlantic Ocean, all the way from Germany. It was nearly as long as 3 football fields, and it was taller than a 15-story building. 1,000 horsepower engines with 20-foot propellers pulled it forward through the air, and the name of this grand airship was the Hindenburg. Mr. Maxwell paused and glanced around. 24 pairs of eyes were glued to his face. 1 pair wasn't. Mark Chelmsley was looking out the window at the falling snow. Still, he's listening, thought Mr. Maxwell. He doesn't have his head down on his desk like yesterday. He's got to be listening. Mr. Maxwell continued. At 7:25, someone shouted, "There it is!" And they were right. It was the Hindenburg, gliding in to tie up at the huge metal mooring tower. But something was wrong. In fact, several things were wrong, and I'm going to show you one of the main things that was terribly, terribly wrong that cloudy spring evening. First, I'll need to put on these special rubber gloves, and my safety glasses, and my plastic face mask. And I'll also need to ask those of you in the first row of desks to push back at least 2 feet, so that you'll be out of danger. The kids in the front scooted their chairs into the aisles and backed up. From a shelf under the table, Mr. Maxwell pulled out a stoppered glass bottle. Holding it up, he said, "This liquid is called hydrochloric acid. This acid is not like the friendly acid that you find in a glass of orange juice. This acid is extremely dangerous. It will eat through metal. It will burn through cloth. It can cause blindness, and it will even burn through flesh and bone."